The 14th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization in Yaoundé, Cameroon, closed its doors without a consensus. The first casualty of this gridlock was the 1998 e-commerce moratorium. For the first time in 26 years, the international ban on taxing digital downloads and electronic transmissions has expired. Sovereign nations can now levy tariffs on the flow of digital goods. The second casualty was the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, a major framework designed to streamline global investment that stalled on the negotiating floor. India was the primary architect of this blockade. Its Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, defended the decision to block the investment agreement as a necessary step to protect the foundational principles of the WTO. Over the last 2 decades, India has transitioned from a developing nation embracing economic reform into a strategic roadblock. To maintain this position, India utilizes 3 structural vulnerabilities within the WTO's rulebook: the requirement for unanimous consensus, agricultural baselines frozen in the 1980s, and self-declared development status. By manipulating these 3 vulnerabilities, a single nation has engineered a procedural deadlock, freezing the modernization of a 166-member global trading system. The foundational flaw of the World Trade Organization is its voting structure. Requiring consensus among 166 nations to write trade rules is mathematically nearly impossible. To bypass this, members rely on plurilaterals. Instead of unanimous consent, a critical mass can agree to adopt binding rules. This was the mechanism behind the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. 125 nations bypass the wider deadlock to create a framework that improves domestic transparency and attracts foreign direct investment. India objects to this workaround. Citing a 2004 mandate, India argues plurilateral agreements lack the unanimous mandate required to be incorporated into the WTO. Because the WTO operates on consensus, India's single veto successfully blocks the 125-member investment agreement from entering the official framework. The procedural objection is a shield. By rejecting plurilateral agreements, India ensures it will not be pressured into complying with new, high-standard rules. Banning plurilaterals forces all global trade negotiations back down to the lowest common denominator. It protects India's own discriminatory domestic trade practices from international oversight. This defensive posture extends to the second pillar of gridlock, agriculture. Between 2021 and 2023, global agricultural support spiked to historic highs of nearly $850 billion a year. To manage the resulting market distortions, the WTO's Agreement on Agriculture categorizes domestic subsidies into specific boxes based on how severely they warp global trade. Looking at this volumetric breakdown, we see the green box, reserved for minimally distorting practices like research and development. The U.S. drops $197 billion here, and China $184 billion. Highly trade-distorting measures fall into the amber box, which is subject to strict spending limits. Then there is Article 6.2, known as the development box. This category gives poorer nations uncapped flexibilities to provide direct assistance to low-income farmers. India utilizes $48 billion in these flexibilities, a level of spending that dwarfs other developing nations. A significant portion of this strategy relies on public stockholding. The Indian government purchases crops at artificially set prices, stores them, and distributes the grain. India reports $34 billion in public stockholding expenditure. While designed for food security, absorbing this much stock at fixed prices creates a significant price floor. The United States, Australia, and Canada recently accused India of utilizing this system to provide an 87% market price support for rice. The allowable limit under WTO rules is 10%. India justifies these distortions as vital protections for its 260 million farmers. Simultaneously, India operates as the world's leading global exporter of rice. Because the WTO calculates these support levels against reference prices frozen between 1986 and 1988, India can shield price supports that heavily distort modern global food trade, avoiding the strict subsidy caps placed on developed economies. The mechanism allowing India to access these exemptions is special and differential treatment. This system was designed to give genuine developing countries longer phase-in periods. This scatterplot maps WTO members by market share against economic development. Despite wide market variance, members self-declare and aggregate into a single developing cluster. In 2019, the U.S. proposed cutting exemptions for OECD/G20 members, or those exceeding 0.5% of global trade. India meets these criteria. India aggressively opposes this, arguing that special and differential treatment is an untouchable treaty right, justified by the persistent poverty gaps within its own borders. When developed nations push for stricter transparency norms, India argues that developing nations genuinely lack the institutional capacity to comply with complex reporting. Other developing nations have complained that this strategy allows larger players to drown out attempts at targeted specific support, preserving maximum flexibility for themselves. India's defense of self-declared development status guarantees an economic power with significant global market share, retains the regulatory exemptions meant for the world's poorest nations. You can see exactly how this gridlock plays out in the recent negotiations to rein in harmful global fishery subsidies. India demanded excessively long phase-in periods under special and differential treatment. The argument was that small-scale traditional fishermen needed protection from rules aimed at heavily subsidized industrial fleets. These demands forced negotiators to pare back the deal. A comprehensive, high-standard agreement on marine resources remains elusive. The fisheries case proves the core tactic. Preserving a broken, low-standard status quo is treated as a better outcome than taking on obligations that match India's actual footprint in the global market. This is the architecture of the WTO trilemma. The self-declared development classification justifies agricultural subsidies, and the plurilateral veto protects both systems from structural modernization. From a domestic policy perspective, this is a rational calculation. It maximizes India's flexibility within a framework built on the market realities of the 1980s. But this short-term domestic flexibility comes at a severe long-term cost: the institutional irrelevance of the World Trade Organization itself. Without updating the 1980s reference prices for agricultural support and establishing objective, data-driven measures for economic development, the deadlock between the global North and South will persist. The failure at the MC14 summit points to an inevitable conclusion. Nations seeking modern rules on digital trade, e-commerce, and investment will simply stop bringing those issues to Geneva. If the blockade continues, the future of global commerce will bypass the multilateral system entirely, migrating into regional free trade agreements and leaving the WTO behind as a structurally obsolete relic.